Welcome again, Khaled, and you need no introduction today. We have already heard your excellent lectures Friday night, Saturday afternoon, and the floor is yours. Please give him a warm applause.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning to everyone. I understand that our topic today is about Arab Israelis or Israeli Arabs or Arab citizens of Israel. And, this is a very sensitive and complex issue. And I'm glad that we are talking about it because there are many misconceptions and failure to understand the reality as it is with regards to I call them the forgotten Arabs in this part of the world. Now, I'm one of those who belong to the Arab community inside Israel. When we talk about Arab Israelis, we are talking about the Arab citizens of Israel, nearly 2 million people. We are the Arabs who, in 1948, did not leave Israel or did not run away or were not expelled or whatever, call it whatever you want. Back then, we were 150,000 Arabs who stayed inside Israel, and Israel thankfully gave us citizenship and helped us build our new lives. We are the Arabs who accepted Israel. We are the Arabs who, until now, have no problem with Israel's existence. In fact, we, the Arab community inside Israel, we have no political demands from Israel. Our only demands are regarding, civilian issues, such as infrastructure, allocation of public funds, employment, equality, and things like that. Although or if you want, because some people keep asking me, how do you define yourself? Are you Arab? Are you Israeli? And I say, look, it's true that many of us, the Arabs in Israel, suffer from what I call a crisis of identity. Why? Because on the one hand, we are Arabs, we're also Muslims, we also belong to the Palestinian people, and we're also Israeli citizens. Now, I personally have no problem calling myself an Israeli citizen. I'm even proud to say that I'm an Israeli citizen under the current circumstances. I have no problem with that. So this crisis of identity does not mean that, we don't accept Israel or we don't want to be part of Israel. Unlike our Palestinian families in the West Bank and Gaza, who are fighting for separation from Israel, we, the Arabs inside Israel, are fighting for the exact opposite. We are fighting for integration into Israel. We all know more or less what the solution is with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It's separation, in one way or another. And this separation is actually happening on the ground, the physical separation. And it's good for Israel before it's good for the Palestinians. And I think you know why. Because if you are not physically and politically separated from the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, you will end up in a binational state. You will have to annex these areas and turn the people over there into Israeli citizens. And honestly, I can't find one Jew living over here who wants to turn another 4 or 5 million Arabs into Israeli citizens. So the good news is that in Israel, a majority of people want the separation from the Palestinian population over there. The whole idea of Oslo is about separating these two communities. It's a divorce between Israeli Jews and Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. So that's happening. And fortunately for Israel, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are demanding separation from Israel. if I were, excuse my expression, a Jew living in Israel, and I woke up one morning and I heard the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza say, we want to become Israeli citizens, I'd be much more worried. So here's the good news. A majority of Jews, a majority of Palestinians knows what they want, or know what they want. They want to be physically, politically separated from each other. The good news is that the Palestinians already have their own parliament, their own government, their own police force, their own court system, their own flag, their own post office even, and that's good for Israel. So, the Palestinians and Israel are headed towards separation. Of course, they will never agree on the terms of the separation. It's like a husband and wife who want to get a divorce, but they can never agree on the terms of the divorce. But at least they know that they don't want to be with each other. So with the Palestinians, with our Palestinian families over there, it's separation. But then, what do you do with 2 million Arabs inside Israel? We are fighting for integration into Israel. We are telling Israel, look, we have no problem. We accepted you. We helped build Israel. The overwhelming majority of us, the Arabs, have been loyal citizens since 1948. Okay, we're not Jews, but that does not turn us into anti-Israel people. Don't judge me according to my religion. Judge me according to whether I'm a good citizen or not. What worries me today is that many of us, the Arabs in Israel, are being judged according to our religion. And that's not good for Israel. Although a majority of Arabs inside Israel have been loyal to Israel, sadly, the Israeli establishment has not been equally loyal towards its Arab citizens. And okay, there is no apartheid inside Israel, but there is a problem when it comes to providing services to the Arab community. There is a problem when it comes to the way the Israeli establishment looks at its non-Jewish citizens. And I'm not, saying anything new over here. These are things that even Israeli governments talk about, and that's good that they openly admit that there is a problem. And the problems I'm talking about are in 3 major fields: employment, infrastructure in the Arab communities, and allocation of public funds. These are the 3 areas where the Arab community inside Israel feels that they are not being treated equally, that they are not getting a fair share from the Israeli government. And I'm not talking about this government or that government, by the way. I'm talking about all Israeli governments over the years. Now, until 20 or 25 years ago, most Arabs inside Israel used to vote for a communist party or join Jewish Arab parties or even Jewish and Zionist parties. But what happened? Some members or some of the leaders of the Arab community came to the Arab community and said, look, why do you keep voting for these parties that are not doing anything for you? Look, Israel doesn't really care. Israel is discriminating against you. Vote for us and we will change the situation. We will show these Israeli Jews that it's not good what they are doing and things like that. And I'm talking about certain Arab Knesset members who managed to exploit the suffering of the Arab community inside Israel to score political gain, to come to the Knesset. So many Arabs said, you know what, let's give them a try. Maybe, these Arab Knesset members will change the situation for us because they're right. Israel is not doing enough in the Arab community. So they voted for Ahmad Tibi, for Azmi Bishara, for Hanin Zoabi, and more recently, in recent years, for Ayman Odeh and other parties. with the hope that when these Arab Knesset members come to the Knesset, they will represent the true interests of the Arab community inside Israel. But what happened? We saw over the past 20 years that most of these Arab Knesset members, instead of representing their constituents, the Arab community inside Israel, they were busy representing the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's not the only point. They were also busy engaging in anti-Israel rhetoric and even doing some things that were seen as anti-Israel, such as going to meet with Hamas leaders, with PLO leaders, with Hafiz al-Assad, even with Hezbollah operatives and things like that. I'm not saying that's the only thing that Arab Knesset members did. No, they did do some things for the Arab community, but these negative actions and the negative rhetoric on their part was highlighted, and it sent the wrong message to the Jewish population inside Israel. It made many Arabs look as if they are a fifth column and an enemy from within. And that's another reason why the gap between Jews and Arabs inside Israel was widened. And that's another reason why the Israeli establishment started looking at the Arab community with suspicion, with more suspicion, with more, I would even say, hostility. Now, something good happened in the last election. Finally, an Arab Israeli, a dentist, he came to the Arab community. I'm talking about Mansour Abbas. He came to the Arab community and said, look, I think it's time for change. I think we need a new approach. Our representatives in the Knesset have failed. They have failed to serve the Arab community. They have failed to represent the true interests of the Arab community. And their attitude is that, they're not in the opposition and they're not part of the coalition. And he said, look, I'm going to change this. I'm going to run for the Knesset on a separate list. And when I promise you that when and if I'm elected, then I will represent the true interests of the Arab community inside Israel. I'm not going to deal with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I'm going to represent you. And this man, Mansour Abbas, although he's an Islamist, by the way, he won 4 seats in the Knesset. And for the first time in Israel's history, you have an Arab party that is part of the coalition in Israel. And that's wonderful news, especially in light of what happened in a few months ago with when we saw the riots and the violence on the streets of Israel during the Gaza war. Now, I see the victory or the success of this party as a turning point in relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. And that's very good. I see it as a beginning of the legitimization of the Arab community inside Israel. And by the way, I like to give credit to those who worked on it. And I give credit to a man called Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister. He was the one who welcomed Mansour Abbas and his party and his line. He's the one who said, if I win the election, then I will join a coalition, or I will bring this new Arab party, Ram, into the coalition. So he gave legitimacy for the first time in many years to an Arab party, sending a message to the Jewish community inside Israel that Arabs can be part of the government, they can serve as ministers and things like that, which, as I said, is good news. Now, as I said, this is a turning point in relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, and ever since the new coalition was formed, we see less tensions right now between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. The Arab community or the Arab Israelis have been in the news recently for two reasons. One of them is the violence, as I said, that erupted last May during the war in Gaza. And this was very dangerous, but the good news is that it has stopped. And the other good news is that not all Arab Israelis were involved in this, only a tiny minority. And that's good news. Number two, the Arab Israelis have been in the news because of an upsurge in violence, violent crime inside Israel. And I would like to see the Israeli establishment do more, first of all, to build confidence or rebuild confidence between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, and secondly, to fight or to intensify its efforts to fight violent crime in the Arab sector. What we are witnessing today is very dangerous in the Arab community. It is, among other things, the result of years of negligence on the part of the Israeli establishment. When I talk about negligence, I'm talking about lack of law enforcement, lack of investment in education and things like that. I'm not exonerating the leaders of the Arab community also, who also bear a responsibility. I'm not exonerating the Arab community itself, because there is a cultural problem also over there with regards to violence. But I would say that the ball right now is in the court of the Israeli government. The Israeli government needs to reassert its power, its force, to show that, the Arab communities are part of Israel. We're not going to allow this violence to escalate. In short, I'm optimistic regarding the future of relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. It's not a lost case. As I said, we, the Arabs in Israel, are fighting for integration. We want to be part of Israel. We want to solve the very serious problem of unemployment. There are many academics who cannot find jobs. We want to solve the problem of lack of investment in the Arab sector. We want industrial zones. We want to see more law enforcement. That's also very important. We want to be accepted as full citizens of Israel. That's what we are saying. Okay, we would like to see a Palestinian state over there, or, we support any solution between Israel and the Palestinians, but that does not make us anti-Israel. Supporting or identifying with the legitimate Palestinian demands in the West Bank and Gaza does not mean that we're anti-Israel. No. As Israeli citizens, we want to see peace between our state, Israel, and our people, the Palestinians. But, we are caught in the middle, we the Arab Israelis. Why? Because our state, Israel, is in conflict with our people, the Palestinians. But we know what we want. We want to see a solution. We want to see a Palestinian state over there. It can also be in Africa, we don't care. But we want to stay inside Israel. Why? Because first of all, we were born there, it's our home. There's no reason why I should go and live in Ramallah or Gaza if I don't have any links to it. And secondly, because we still feel much more comfortable inside Israel than we do over there. And, I go to Ramallah, and I can tell you, every second person I meet, he or she asks me if I know someone in Israel that they can bribe to move into Israel. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. But as I said, we have problems with Israel as an Arab minority, but we know what we want. We want to stay inside Israel because I believe that I can solve my problems with Israel, and I do see some governments doing. I'm not saying that Israel hasn't done anything for the Arab community. No. I'm just saying Israel is not doing enough. The last government, the Benjamin Netanyahu government, its rhetoric towards the Arabs was negative. You had some politicians who tried to delegitimize the Arab community and things like that. But I can tell you, its actions were very good. That government invested in the Arab sector, hundreds of millions of shekels. That government helped integrate Arabs, absorb them into the public and private sectors, and things like that. So the rhetoric was bad, the actions were very good. Now we have a government where the rhetoric is good, and the actions, we haven't seen a lot of it, but it seems that, it will be good. There's talk about investing, I think, more than 30 million shekels, or 30 billion shekels. I can't remember the exact figure, in the Arab sector. This is according to the coalition agreement, which is good. It is in Israel's interest to embrace its Arab citizens and not alienate them. As I said, the majority of us are loyal citizens to Israel. If there is an Arab citizen who is not happy in Israel, who does not want to be part of Israel, then he can always leave. But as long as the majority of us are saying that we want to be part of Israel, it's our home, we accept Israel, then there's no reason, as I said, that there should be any kind of discrimination against the Arab community inside Israel. That does not serve Israel's interests. So the good news is that we do see the situation inside Israel calming down. This is a very sensitive issue, the issue of the Arab Israelis. Why? Because if you do not work on improving the living conditions of the Arab community inside Israel, then one day you might have an intifada. These Arabs will revolt. And then what do? I mean, this intifada will be on the streets of Jaffa and Haifa and the Negev and the Galilee. And it's unlike, it will be different from the intifadas that you have on the other side of the border or the Green Line. So, as I said, it's not a lost case. The majority of the Arabs I see are talking about integration. There's a more openness right now, and there's more optimism. You need to give the young people hope. The young people are saying, we want jobs. We want to feel that this is our state. And I do see many positive stories right now. I see people going to work in the courts, lawyers, judges. I see more Arabs in the hospitals. I see people, Arabs, holding very high positions in the government. And I mean, that's how it should be. A citizen is a citizen is a citizen. Don't judge me according to my religion, I keep saying. Judge me according to whether I'm a good citizen or not. If you want to go according to religion, I can bring you 10 Jews who are much more anti-Israel than many people I've met in my life. This is not about you. And I can bring you 25 Muslims who are much more loyal to Israel than many Jews I've met in my life. So it's not about religion. But on the other hand, look, I'm not naive. I know there's a conflict. And I know that many Jews are afraid. Today, unfortunately and sadly, and this is a barrier that we need to bring down, many of my Jewish friends no longer see a difference between Khaled, the loyal Arab Israeli citizen, and Ahmad, the suicide bomber from Gaza. They think we're just a bunch of Arabs who want to destroy Israel. And that's not true. As I said before, we are loyal citizens who are fighting for integration. But I blame first and foremost the leaders of the Arab community inside Israel for this. And I blame those leaders who are inciting the Arab community inside Israel against Israel. How does it serve my interest as an Arab citizen of Israel If my representative in the Knesset, in the parliament, is inciting against Israel or goes to meet with PLO and Hamas leaders or makes all these inflammatory statements against Israel, on the contrary, that causes me more damage as an Arab citizen of Israel. It is because of this rhetoric, it is because of these actions that many Arabs cannot find jobs, that many Arabs are looked upon as if they are an enemy from within. And that's why the Arabs inside Israel need new leadership. Now, I know that some people will tell you, well, Mansour Abbas is an Islamist, and okay, he's an Islamist. I also know that, the Knesset is the only place now in the Middle East where you have officially representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood over there. The Arab world is getting rid of them. And okay, but that's democracy. But look, I look at this man's agenda, not his background. As long as this man is doing the right thing and saying, I came to the Knesset to serve the Arab community and not to serve the PLO and Hamas, then I think that's that's exactly what the Arabs need. And if the Prime Minister of Israel and the Foreign Minister of Israel and the former Prime Minister of Israel legitimize a party like that and a man like that, then, we are moving in the right direction. But Israel needs to be very careful about the way it treats its Arab citizens. And I said before, this is a very explosive issue. And Israel needs to be very careful. We are loyal citizens of Israel. Okay, we don't, sing Hatikva every morning. We don't identify with Jewish symbols and things like that. But that does not mean that we are disloyal citizens. Don't judge me according to whether I sing a song or not, or an anthem, or whether I carry an Israeli flag or not. This is not how you judge people's loyalty. And you should not expect a Muslim, for example, to sing Hatikva. I have respect for it. I have no problem with it. We, the Arabs in Israel, are not trying to change Israel's Jewish character. Because some people keep telling me, well, you are a demographic threat. No, we are not a demographic threat. We have no problem with Israel being a Jewish state. Go, be a Jewish state. Why? I can't even understand. Why is Israel asking me, the Arab citizen of Israel, to recognize Israel as a Jewish state? No, be a Jew. Why do you need my permission? You want to be a Jewish state? That's fine with me. I have no problem with it. It was never a problem for me. Just give me my rights. Give me jobs. Let me live. Israel can be a Jewish state for all its citizens. I don't see any contradiction over there. I don't even understand why people keep raising it, this whole issue. Unless they have other incentives, but I don't understand why this issue keeps coming up, because we are not trying to replace synagogues with mosques. We are not trying to change the Israeli flag, and we're not trying to change the anthem. Go sing the anthem, have your own flag, do whatever you want, but treat me equally. That's what we are saying. And thankfully, Israel is respecting freedom of worship for the Muslims. We have autonomy. We even have Sharia courts in Israel, which is very good. And as I said, it should not be a problem. There should be total separation between these issues. The issue of Israel's Jewish character and the issue of the rights of minorities inside Israel. So, for now, as I said, there is room for optimism. And I don't know if you'd like to ask questions about this whole issue, or was that, insufficient?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Toameh. We are now opening up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, please come up here. Yeah, please line up here.
Thank you so much for your question, your presentation. I have a question regarding the Sharia courts that you just mentioned. How come there is or did I hear misinterpret your presentation that there are Sharia courts in Israel? And that's a new thing for me, at least. I haven't heard about that one. And also, do you think that there should be more assimilation into how to look on the foreign policy and so on for Israel, instead of looking at they are Palestinians and they are Israelis, therefore they have to support a faction or another one? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard the second part of the question. The second question.
Well, it was regarding foreign policy, since a lot of Israeli Jews, they have a certain view on how the foreign policy should be conducted. And now I'm generalizing a bit, but the Arabs have historically had very different views. What are your predictions on how the foreign policy will be proceeded with the new government when you have, in lack of a better word, an Islamic party in the coalition? Thank you.
Well, regarding the Sharia courts, I don't know why you are surprised that there are Sharia courts. The word Sharia should not have a negative connotation. I know that some people think of Sharia as being, amputating people's arms or hands or stoning women. No. We have religious courts inside Israel, and this is something good that Israel has done, by allowing the Arab or the Muslim community inside Israel to have their own court system. If these courts deal, first of all, they report to the Israeli Ministry of Religious Affairs. They're not 100% independent. It's not that they can do anything they want. They're under the supervision of the Israeli Ministry of Religion and the Israeli government and other Israeli courts, by the way, higher courts. And secondly, they deal mostly with civilian issues, or almost entirely with civilian issues, such as divorce, custody, such as paying, allowances to a wife or a husband, a divorce issue, things like that, and marriages. And it's good because you don't want, where else will they go? Will they go to rabbinical court, the Muslims? So that's good. And at the same time, Muslims who are not satisfied with the rulings of the Sharia courts can always apply to the Israeli civilian courts. So in that sense, first of all, it's not new. This has been going on for decades. And secondly, thank you, Israel, for allowing the Muslim community inside Israel to have their own court systems, which is something that the Arabs have demanded and Israel has accepted. Now, regarding foreign policy, I don't know what foreign policy you are talking about, but by and large, the Arab party that came into the coalition did not come there because of Arab concerns regarding Israel's foreign policy. It came there to serve the interests of the Arab community inside Israel, and that's much more pressing. That's much more urgent. On the other hand, I can tell you that I don't hear any kind of criticism from the Arab Israelis regarding Israel's foreign policy. Many Arabs are actually happy about the peace agreements that were reached with some of the Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates. And although the rhetoric of the leaders of the Arab community inside Israel has not been encouraging towards these agreements, I can tell you that tens of thousands of, if not hundreds of thousands of Arab Israelis have already gone to the United Arab Emirates. They're already doing business with the United Arab Emirates, and that's good. So in that regard, the foreign policy is something that the Arabs also benefit from.
Thanks.
I have a question. Thank you for your speech. My question is, did Mansour Abbas have a loyalty problem during the 11 days of the Gaza war in May?
Sorry, did he have a loyalty problem?
Yes. There was much talk about changing the Netanyahu government in May. And there was negotiations with Naftali Bennett and the others on creating the present government. And Mansour Abbas was important in that coalition talk. Then came the war in May, 11 days, and he was suddenly very, very quiet about the question of defending Israel against the rockets from Gaza.
Look, I mean, I think that Mansour, I'm not a spokesman for Mansour Abbas, but I think that he was walking a tightrope. He was trying to show that, I don't want to be involved in such critical and controversial issues. And that's why he probably remained silent. I don't know if it's a problem of loyalty, but on the other hand, I mean, you can't expect any Arab to stand up and say, I support, any Arab politician to stand up and say, I support the Israeli military operation against Hamas. That will, first of all, show that his agenda is not to serve the Arab community inside Israel, that he's not different from the rest of the Arab Knesset members who are attacking Israel all day. And secondly, that would have, put him on a collision course with his future coalition partners. So I think that he stayed away from that issue because of the sensitivity of the talks and the negotiations regarding the coalition.
Thanks for your lecture. How can Israel be an example of integration of minorities to the European countries?
Well, I mean, first of all, we the Arab community, we are not immigrants. This is very important to remember. We are here, we are living here. We did not come from outside and just decide that we want to be, we want to live here in Israel. We were born here. We were born Israeli citizens. We were born into the Israeli system, the political system, the cultural system. We are an integral part of Israel, and that's how we see ourselves. Now, I think that the Europeans can learn from Israel many things. For example, respect for the rights of the minorities, allowing them to have their own, their own traditions and things like that, but all under the supervision of the state. It's successful in Israel because the education is under the supervision of the state. The courts, the Islamic courts, are under the supervision of the state. Everything is under the supervision. I mean, it's not that you can act separately. We, the Arabs in Israel, are not trying to change Israel's character. I think that some people who are coming to Europe, I think that they don't feel comfortable in a Western culture. And these people are trying to impose their traditions, their faith on non-Muslim communities, and that's a mistake. I say, if you are a Muslim who wants to live in Canada or in Europe, in a Western country, in a Christian-dominated country, then you have to accept the character and the nature of that country, and not try to change it, not try to impose your own faith and your own beliefs on them.
Thanks. Any other questions for Mr. Toameh? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. You were talking about the new government in Israel. That is Israel and Jews and Arabs they can cooperate. What about Hamas and the Palestinian authorities? Do you think they, from time to time, they've had some talks about making one single government? Are they serious, or is it just some talk in front of international media?
I mean, first of all, I don't understand why anyone should be worried about whether Hamas and Fatah make peace or not, or whether they achieve unity or not. That's their problem. In Israel, we have the most diverse government ever. This is a government that includes right wing, left wing, the center, Arabs, gay people, religious people, and this is something great. You know what? The Palestinians need to learn from Israel. But I can tell you, if you go to Google, you will see how many times I've written stories saying, Fatah and Hamas are very close to ending their dispute. Now they've signed. How many agreements have they signed in the last 13 or 14 years? Probably 6 or 7. Reconciliation agreements, unity agreements. But that's their problem. Israel should not be meddling in the internal affairs of the Palestinians. Let them do whatever they want. Just look after your security. If they have democracy, that's good for them. If they are united, that's good for them. But Israel should only look after Israel's security. Israel should tell these people, listen, do whatever you want. You want to kill each other, that's fine with us. You want to slaughter each other. You want to throw each other from the 15th and 17th floors, that's also fine with us. Don't mess with our security. Israel's policy should be talk to and work with any Palestinian who wants to work with you and talk to you, and shoot back at anyone who shoots at you. That's all what Israel can do under the current circumstances.
My question is, the Arab community inside Israel, how are they reacting to the rockets coming from Hamas in Gaza? And are Arab politicians who are in the Knesset, are they speaking out against these actions?
Look, and I think it's a mistake to make generalizations and say this is the Arab community's response. I'm aware of the fact that some Arabs in Israel were happy about the firing of the rockets. Some of them celebrated that. Some of them identified with Hamas. Some of them expressed support for Hamas. I'm not denying that. I'm not saying, but we need to be very careful about making generalizations. If there are people in Israel who identify with the rocket attacks and who support Hamas, then Israel has the tools to deal with them. Israel is a democracy. Israel is a country of law and order. And if someone breaks the law, then they should be punished. Now, the Arab politicians, again, I can't talk about the Arab politicians as one whole unit. We can't put all of them in one basket, but I can tell you that there are some of them who called for an end to the hostilities. They're very careful about criticizing Hamas or the Palestinian groups in Gaza because they're afraid of a backlash. They're afraid of being accused by their own constituents and by other people on social media, especially, of being traitors. So, you got different reactions, but again, I didn't see one Arab politician in the Knesset who stood up and said, this is bad, it needs to stop, and that also worries me. I'd like to see Arabs inside Israel. I'm not saying they should join the Zionist movement tomorrow morning, and I'm not saying they should become more pro-Zionist than many Zionists, but I'm just saying that, if your country is attacked, then you need to come out against these terrorist groups because this is not good for even for the people of Gaza.
Hello, my name is Kristian, and thank you for talking with us today. I have a question regarding the talk you did yesterday about the Palestinian authorities, if that's okay. Do you think that you've seen over the last few months, or at least the last year, that a lot of Arab and Muslim countries have opened diplomatic relationships with Israel, And do you think that if this trend continues, that maybe the Palestinian authorities will have to change their stance towards Israel? And if they don't, do you see perhaps the Palestinian leaderships becoming isolated from the rest of the Arab community or some Arab countries if they continue with these violent relationships towards Israel?
Well, I mentioned yesterday that there's a problem with education. Look, it's very simple. Here's how you need to understand it. If you want to make peace with Israel, you need to prepare your people for peace with Israel. If you want to make peace with Israel, you don't wake up every morning and tell your people Israel is bad, Israel is committing genocide, Israel is kidnapping the children, Israel is destroying the trees, Israel is raping the woman, Israel. These messages do not contribute to any kind of peace with Israel. On the contrary, these messages, they serve the interests of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Why? These two groups are sitting there and saying, well, you see folks, we told you, you should not trust Israel. We told you that there's no point in negotiating with Israel. We should be firing at Israel. Now, the sad news is that the Palestinian Authority was the first Palestinian party to come out against the Abraham Accords. They were the first party to strongly denounce the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And by doing so, they enraged not only the United Arab Emirates, but many people in the Gulf who said, you Palestinians are ungrateful. We don't want anything to do with you. The Palestinians, I think, made a big mistake. If you don't like these agreements, you should have at least shut up. But once you come out against them and you start I was talking to many people in the Gulf back then, last year, and they were saying, oh, look who's talking, Mahmoud Abbas, who signed the Oslo Accords with Israel, who is protected by Israel because Mahmoud Abbas would not be in power in Ramallah had it not been for the fact that Israeli soldiers are sitting less than 1 mile away from his office and from his home. And look who's talking, Mahmoud Abbas, who is conducting security coordination with Israel. He's accusing us, the people in the Gulf, of being traitors. So there's a very deep crisis right now between most of the Arab countries and the Palestinian Authority, and it's not new, by the way. I also mentioned yesterday that most of the Arab countries do not support the Palestinians financially, and as such, they have no leverage with the Palestinians. If you don't give the Palestinians money, then you can't set any conditions to them. The only people who have leverage with the Palestinians are those who are funding the Palestinians, and I'm referring to the Palestinian Authority. And who are these? There are two main parties, the United States of America and Europe. So they are the ones who need to go to the Palestinian Authority and ask them, to bring down the volume against Israel. And that will pave the way in the future for a new moderate and pragmatic generation that will accept the Abraham Accords, that will see, an opportunity for peace with Israel. So it goes back to education. It's not going to happen overnight. And again, I'm not saying the Palestinians need to become pro-Israel. I'm just saying stop delegitimizing Israel and demonizing Jews. And by doing so, you will pave the way for the emergence of a new generation that is much more moderate.
Yeah, hello. My name is Odd, and thank you for your work and interesting information. You were talking about integration in Israel, and that was very interesting to hear. What about integration of Jews in Gaza and the West Bank? Is that an issue at all? I remember the Gaza when it was autonomous, and all the Jews that were there seemed to have left. And what about the West Bank? Why is it a problem to have Jewish settlements or Jews living there? We all know about probably 500,000 Jews who came from Arab countries to Israel to be integrated. And we all know historically about the problems in Europe with persecution of Jews and the pogroms in Europe and Arab countries. So what are you and other Arabs doing to look at this historically and change the issue and start allowing integration of Jews back in Arab territories? Baghdad, for instance, was a very Jewish city some years ago.
I mean, it's an interesting question, but look, the difference between us, the Arab Israelis, the Arab citizens of Israel, and the Jews living in the West Bank and Gaza is that we, the Arab Israeli community, we are citizens of Israel, while the Jews living or who were living in Gaza and are living today in the West Bank, they are not Palestinian citizens. You're talking about integration. What do you want to integrate them into? I mean, let's assume that there are Jews in Gaza. Do they want to work in the Hamas government? The Jews living in the West Bank, do they want to be part of the Palestinian Authority? Do they want to go there, to work there? No. They are Israeli citizens. These Jews living there are Israeli citizens. So that's the difference. But I personally, I have no problem with people, regaining their rights. If there are Jews who lost rights and property in the Arab countries or elsewhere, they are entitled to it. They need to be compensated. If they want to go back, they can go back. I have no problem with Jews living in the West Bank or in Gaza or wherever they want. The whole idea of, what does peace mean? Doesn't peace mean that people should be allowed to live wherever they want? I can't understand, to be honest with you, why does peace always mean kicking Jews out of their homes? How many times have we tried this over the last 40 years? We saw it in Sinai, we saw it in Gaza, we saw it in some parts of the West Bank. I didn't see that bring peace. On the contrary, I saw that brought more wars and more conflict. So, you know what? People should be allowed to live wherever they want. But I'm not, living in an illusion. I know the risks. I know that it's not safe. Today, I don't even know one Palestinian who wants to go and live in Gaza. It's not there. And I think that, it's an awful situation. I remember the good old days before peace. Before the Oslo Accords. And honestly, I miss those days. When I used to go to Gaza with my Jewish friends, and we used to eat at El Salam fish restaurant, and then we would go shopping in downtown Gaza, and then we would go and buy spare parts for cars in Khan Yunis. I remember the good old days before peace, when this was one open country where people could just move around. In the good old days before peace, anyone in Gaza could wake up in the morning, get into his car, drive to Tel Aviv, live in Tel Aviv, work in Tel Aviv, and return at the end of the day if he wants. But those days are gone. We can't ignore the reality on the ground. The Oslo Accords has further complicated the situation. As someone who lives here and someone who has been following this conflict for many years, I saw more peace between Jews and Arabs before the Oslo Accords than after the Oslo Accords. which raises many questions, by the way. The Oslo Accords brought us Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the PLO and militias and gangs and mafias. And ever since the Oslo Accords were signed, tensions between Israel and the Palestinians has been intensifying. And where we headed, I don't know, but the situation on the ground does not look good. I think that Israeli Jews should do what is good for them. They should look after their security and just, not meddle in the internal affairs of the Palestinians. The situation over there is very complicated, by the way. And it's not easy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Toameh. It has been a great pleasure to have you with us. And thanks for responding to difficult questions this Sunday morning. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.